What makes a good oyster? A good oyster is an oyster that's been well cared for. That results in an oyster that has a really nice shape, a strong, hard shell.
We have oysters on the menu because we think that it's in the spirit of a good meal. It should start with oysters.
Whether it's eaten raw on the half shell, fried, baked, or in a stew, oysters have been part of our collective palate for centuries. New York oysters were once sought out as the best oysters you could buy because of their unique flavor from the natural environment.
Somebody said, "Oh, I'm going to New York next week." They'd say, "Enjoy the oysters." It was the most signature New York food.
Oysters have been a constant throughout history, but hidden beneath the waters of New York's harbor is a little-known tale, a tumultuous history that led to the disappearance of native oysters.
There was a big crisis in the 19th century because they harvested so many oysters they started running out of them.
This, plus pollution, led to a rapid decline and wiped out the remaining oysters in the harbor.
For some reason, it really wasn't reflected on very much that it might be unhealthy to dump raw sewage on a food supply, and they started having epidemics.
Now, environmental groups are looking to reverse a century-old problem by returning these tiny yet mighty mollusks to the harbor.
My name is Paul McCormick. I'm the owner of the Great Gun Oyster Farm in Richards Bay, Long Island. A Long Island, New York oyster is one of the purest, most delicious oysters you can have anywhere in the country. It's an incredible, incredible product. This is one of the best things about living in New York. Back in the 1990s, I was a wild harvester. I was a clammer. Fortunately, after a number of years, the clam population declined due to overharvesting. When I finally was able to get back onto the bay 20 years later, it soon became apparent that economically, oysters was a much better route to go. Amazing. So creamy. It's really, really sweet. Some nice brine. The marine environment is, it's an integral part of Long Island's identity. I'm proud to be a part of that. We have a rich maritime history here, and this is sort of the latest iteration, an advent of a new industry here on Long Island, small-scale shellfish farming. A lot of the wild stocks have been depleted over the years, and this is a sort of an answer to that.
While places like Connecticut and New Jersey also had thriving oyster beds, the ones that grew in the New York harbor were considered the best you could eat, not because they were a unique species, but because of the unique environment they grew in.
A curious thing about oysters is that they're like wine grapes. They're all about terroir. There are different species of oysters, but all of the East Coast oysters from Labrador down to Florida and even in the Gulf like Louisiana, all the same species, and they're just different because they're growing in different places.
Mark Kurlansky is considered the go-to guy for all things on the history of oysters in the New York harbor.
There were just oysters everywhere, all over the harbor, all around Staten Island, Brooklyn and Queens, Ellis Island, and the island of the Statue of Liberty. They were called actually Big and Little Oyster Islands.
At the height of New York's oyster era, it was said that there were 350 square miles of oyster beds. That's 15 times larger than the island of Manhattan. Pearl Street in Lower Manhattan was once quite literally paved with oysters.
When Henry Hudson first sailed into New York Harbor, he probably could see through to the bottom. The water was so clear from all these oysters. By the 18th century, New York was all about eating oysters, and in the 19th century, even more so. It's a very unusual phenomenon in history to find a food that feeds the rich and poor in the exact same way at the same time. Food either becomes fashionable or it becomes what the poor are stuck with. And in the case of oysters in New York, it was both.
Today's Americans only eat about 3 oysters a year, but in the golden age of oysters, New Yorkers were eating about 600 oysters a year. Streetcars sold them for cents on the dollar, while places like Grand Central Oyster Bar served them in opulent fashion. New York's booming oyster tourism in the early 1900s began to put a strain on local oyster beds.
There was a big crisis in the 19th century because they harvested so many oysters they started running out of them. So what they did was they went down to Maryland and they harvested Chesapeake oysters and planted them in New York.
This strategy lasted for a while until a new problem unfolded. many people began contracting diseases and foodborne illnesses like typhoid.
For some reason, it really wasn't reflected on very much that it might be unhealthy to dump raw sewage on a food supply. And they started having epidemics. Along came Louis Pasteur and the science to understand where these diseases came from and how to track them down. And lo and behold, they kept tracking them down to oyster beds. So one at a time, they closed down beds.
The last operating oyster bed in Raritan Bay on Staten Island was closed in 1927, ending the centuries-long practice of harvesting oysters in the New York harbor.
Oysters still lived in the harbor until they did other things. Chemical pollution, petrochemicals, Agent Orange, and all the toxic stuff that they used in Vietnam was made in New Jersey and dumped in the harbor. And it got to the point where oysters couldn't even live. You know, like in the 1950s, if you put oysters in the water, they would die. Their shells would be eaten away by chemicals.
The state of the New York harbor was bleak. No oysters meant other marine life vanished, and the waters became murky dead zones. In 1972, the Clean Water Act prohibited the dumping of waste and raw sewage into the harbor. It took 28 years for life to return to the harbor in the form of oysters and small fish. By 2010, New Yorkers had their first whale sighting in over a century.
I mean, I remember when I was a kid, the water in New York was sort of dark and pearly. Just the fact that so many oysters can grow in New York Harbor again is a hugely positive message.
While the oysters in New York's harbor are no longer edible, there are still oysters being farmed in Connecticut and Long Island.
Work never stops. We work 52 weeks of the year. I guess as a starting point, we purchase shellfish seed from a hatchery. We purchase them at about the size of our pinky nail, about 20 millimeters, and we purchase 750, 800,000 seed. We'll go out and we'll deploy that seed into floating bags. These are mesh bags.
Paul and farm staff spend months tending to the oysters to produce the best possible oysters to eat.
During the course of the year, when we're splitting the seed, we're also shaking the bags vigorously to chip off the leading edge of growth. Oysters grow out long and flat. If you let them, we have to chip that leading edge of growth to sort of force them to grow deep, and they form round cups, and that produces more meat, and that's the desirable element that we want for those oysters.
They also have to contend with ice, wildlife, and changing tides in order to assure as many of the oysters as possible reach harvesting size.
To get to the late fall and approaching winter, we have to sink the entire farm. So we have to cut the flotation off all the gear and sink the farm to make sure that we don't get caught in any ice formations in the wintertime. That's a huge endeavor. It takes us almost 2 months to sink the entire farm. Even through the winter, we're harvesting all winter long, and we also have to flip those bags on the bottom so they don't get over-silted. So we have one boat that just harvests 52 weeks of the year, 5 days a week. We have another crew that takes care of all the other mechanics and other elements of the work that need to be done.
Great Gun Oyster Farm is located in an area that offers a very diverse variety of oyster flavors because of the different microhabitats available to the farmers.
Each section is subject to different environmental conditions, which has an effect on the taste of the oysters, believe it or not. Some people would say they have a real sweet taste, a very, very crisp taste. If you move over to this section of the farm, now you're like situated directly across from salt marsh. These oysters actually have a little bit of a different flavor. Oysters up in the front of the farm, especially this section right here, they're subject to most of the prevailing winds. So those oysters get jostled around more than any of the other oysters on the farm. And because they're in constant motion, more so than any of the other oysters, they develop oversized muscles inside the shells. And so that changes the texture of those.
The oysters at Great Gun also seem to benefit from the variety of environments because they actually grow faster than normal Long Island oysters.
So typically oysters here in this region take 18 to 24 months from the time they're spawned in a hatchery to reach maturity. And for a variety of factors, mainly being what I consider to be an overabundance of food, our farm brings oysters to market within 6 or 7 months.
Oysters have been enjoyed by the ultra-wealthy and the working class for centuries. When New York was at the height of its oyster era, you could purchase oysters from a street cart for a few cents. Meanwhile, the rich were ordering them in lavish banquet halls and restaurants like the Grand Central Oyster Bar. Today, oysters can be found for $1 across the country and in fine dining restaurants like Le Crocodile at the White Hotel in Brooklyn.
Freshly shucked cold oyster on ice is an opportunity to experience the pure flavors of the ocean. You don't have to do anything other than just open it and enjoy it. He never checked an oyster until he started working here. How cool is that?
Chef Aidan O'Neill is the executive chef at the Wythe Hotel in Brooklyn. He's in charge of creating the food program at 2 different eateries at the hotel. The menus at the Wythe Hotel are crafted to give guests the best possible dining experience.
We have oysters on the menu because we think that it's in the spirit of a good meal. It should start with oysters. Our sourcing practices are based on best available oyster that we can get. Typically it's the most expensive, but we just don't compromise on the oysters that we buy.
Running a restaurant is a balancing act that is no small feat. Every detail has to be on point. Those running the show at the Wythe Hotel feel a sense of responsibility to achieve this balance sustainably.
I have a pretty guilty conscience about the amount of damage that my industry does. The amount of food waste that goes through restaurants is pretty frustrating. You do your best to control before any of the food gets on the plate, and you want to make sure as much of the food that you purchase goes out the front door of the restaurant.
So when offered the chance to reduce some of that waste and give back to the environment, Chef Aidan thought partnering with the Billion Oyster Project was a no-brainer.
They approached us, and I mean, that's a very easy yes. We always want to be participating in anything that's rebuilding the environment in New York City. We humans have certainly done enough damage, so any way we can participate to restore it. It's important to be involved in sustainable food practices because it is the history of food practice.
The Billion Oyster Project grew from a school assignment created by 2 teachers at the Urban Assembly New York Harbor School almost 2 decades ago. The project aimed to engage their students in hands-on environmental work that would have a positive impact on the harbor.
Our executive director, Pete Malinowski, was the aquaculture teacher. Him and Murray Fisher kind of developed this idea of restoring oysters with students in New York Harbor, and the first few projects that they completed really propelled into the formation of Billion Oyster Project.
Pete and Murray officially launched Billion Oyster Project in 2014 with 2 big goals in mind.
Over the years, our mission has changed ever so slightly, but the main part of it is to restore oyster reefs to New York Harbor through public education initiatives. The 2 main goals we're working towards is to restore 1 billion oysters by 2035 and engage 1 million people by 2035.
Danielle Bissett is the Director of Restoration at the Billion Oyster Project. She has a hand in every step of oyster reef creation.
We have 4 programs: oyster production, fabrication, shell collection, and oyster reefs. So under each of those programs, there's a lot of logistics and operations that happen to get oysters in the water. The pathway for an oyster shell in New York City is starting at a restaurant. That's where the shell is separated from the waste streams, and then we go and pick up those shells and bring them to Governor's Island to cure. Once that curing process is done in a year, then we bring that shell over to our set tanks, and that's where we put larvae in the tanks and they set to our shell, and then we deploy them as we're doing today. And over time, those oysters grow out of those structures, encase that structure, and create a reef.
As they grow, they filter out natural hazards to other marine life and over time clarify the water.
We have 2 structures going in, one gabions that are filled with shell, and the second are reef balls. Reef balls are a hollow dome, like they have circular cutouts on the sides to allow like fish passage and use that as habitat or a shelter.
So far, Billion Oyster Project has restored 100 million juvenile oysters and is on track to add 50 million each season. Just like with replanting forests, it takes time to monitor the growth of the oysters and to make sure they're healthy and thriving.
The really cool thing is that when we're looking at our reefs underwater, the clarity does seem to lift a little and you can see better, and that's, you know, kind of showcasing the power of oysters and their water filtration process. You know, if oyster reefs were everywhere, the water clarity would be really amazing. You'd be able to see pretty far down.
Restaurants like the one run by Chef Aidan provide the recycled shells.
It's about 300 or 400 a day between the bar and the restaurant. They're scrubbed down until they're very, very clean, and they're stored on ice, always with the flat side up, bellies down, because you want to make sure that you store them as they grow. If you store the oysters upside down, the juices will leak out, which is also phenomenal because it's actually just like it's transported clean water from the ocean. So it's like every time you have an oyster, you're just sipping a bit of like cold Canadian ocean water, which is like pretty special. And then after the guests finish enjoying the oysters, they come back to the kitchen and they go to a big container that's in the dish area. At the end of the night, we pass all those oyster shells through the dish machine. We get them brand new and clean. And then at the end of the week, they get picked up in the giant oyster containers that we have in our waste area in the hotel. So this is just the start of the night. So we have some oyster shells in there. They're gonna be washed through our dish machine and then they'll be picked up at the end of the week. But we do a lot of composting, a lot of recycling here, but they'll pile up over the night and then they'll be picked up at the end of the week. You know, if you're living in a city like New York, you're not often connecting with the environment. You're really connecting with a human, city-centric perspective. For our cooks to know that they're recycling the oyster shells that go back into the river and back into the environment, it's one of those rare moments when you actually are connecting with nature.
As the water quality has improved and as our work has been progressing over the years, we have been seeing more and more wild oysters along the shoreline or again on our own reef structures. So it's another good indication that this area can support oysters and can support our larger restoration goal of restoring 1 billion oysters to see self-sustaining oyster populations kind of take over and not need us. So just giving nature that foothold is really important, and that's the intention, that's what we're doing.
Though their numbers have waned, oysters have been a constant through history as both a food and environmental asset. The push to restore oyster beds to New York's harbor is something the students at the Harbor School on Governor's Island are working to solve.
The program that we have with the Harbor School and Billion Oyster Project, I think is the most unique program I've ever seen. Collaboration with a public high school and a not-for-profit that actually has students engaged with real work. They're not just learning the sciences just to do it in a class and that test is thrown out. They're actually applying it.
Aaron Singh has been teaching at the New York Harbor School since it first opened its doors in 2002. The original school was located in Bushwick. The heart of the program was the same then as it is now: give students a head start in marine careers.
It has morphed since to a staff of 60 plus, benefiting many more students in Harbor School. They're in over 100 middle schools throughout the city.
The students that attend the Harbor School on Governor's Island are heavily involved in the cultivation of baby oysters, setting of oyster reefs, and monitoring their growth cycles.
Here, if you could focus it, you could see some of the spat on here. There's like baby oysters.
What is spat?
That is the young life cycle of an oyster where they attach to calcium carbonate, which is what the oyster.
This is a big spat?
Yeah.
We're counting how many spat are on the shell. The intention is that the spat are each going to get an individual shell, and from that shell they're going to grow into a full oyster.
Some students that attended the New York Harbor School were inspired to continue their work with Billion Oyster Project as full-time jobs.
Going through this program and Aaron reinforcing that this is something that we need in order to restore this harbor, it kind of just gave me more purpose, and that was the reason why I came back as a teacher and wanting to further my career through this, is just because I want to get more inner city kids into this program and into Billion Oyster Project, just understanding what these oysters do.
My name is Mark Melendez, and I am the waterfront director here at Billion Oyster Project. It's cool to see that Harbor School has gone from just focusing on getting children into the maritime industry to having an environmental aspect, right? The whole point of people nowadays is kind of living to find a way for the world to be sustainable for all of us. And having a hand in that with Harbor School and Billion Oyster Project is just amazing.
I wrote my book because it was a cautionary tale about urban pollution. How there was this great cultural and gastronomic and economic resource here that was just totally destroyed for no reason. I mean, this was nature's plan for an estuary, is that you'd have this brackish water and then you'd have these animals that kept filtering it. So it makes the system much healthier to have the oysters again.
Oysters may be small, but their presence has a huge impact on maintaining healthy ecosystems, from providing food for marine species to acting as tidal barriers that protect us from flooding.
If we are able to put 1 billion oysters in New York Harbor, it will actually cycle the water column in New York Harbor every 3 days, which is pretty valuable. One oyster actually produces around 60 gallons of water a day, so it's an amazing organism.
It's just a really exciting opportunity to reconnect people to what oysters can do and how it benefits them. And you kind of see people's faces light up and you're like, wow, that's really cool, I didn't know that.
From the harbor of New York City to the waters surrounding Long Island and Connecticut, oysters will continue to find new life.
You can never get away from the farm because, again, you have like 750,000 live animals that you have to take care of, so nature at work.